Good evening and a very warm welcome to this special program where we will be discussing the state of the economy, particularly economic management and fiscal policy. I'm your host, Ngenda Kamayoyo, and we will be together throughout the entire duration of this program. Now, the civil society poverty observatory group movement of over 30 civil society organizations in Zambia, working across all the 10 provinces that seeks to exact greater accountability for poverty reduction efforts in Zambia and provide cutting-edge policy advice to the Zambian government on poverty alleviation and sustainable development goals as espoused in Zambia's National Development Framework. The CS-POG provides a platform for the strengthening and coordination of civil society efforts in heightening public policy engagement with government on the poverty alleviation and sustainable development agenda. The CS-POG has been instrumental in amplifying the voices of civil society organizations on issues of poverty and inequality. The CS-POG is implementing a project called State of the Economy, and this is what we are going to be discussing this evening. This project has 4 clusters, namely energy crisis and its impact on the economy, decentralization, citizen engagement and dialogue with local government, economic management and fiscal discipline, as well as diversification. With support from Oxfam, the CS-POG is running a number of activities to engage citizens, policymakers, and other stakeholders on the economic management cluster. The Center for Trade Policy and Development, CTPD, one of the members of the CS-POG, is implementing activities on the State of the Economy project on this process. One of the activities is this program that we bring to you this evening, and we are discussing Zambia's state of the economy. I have with me in this studio Kabinga Musonda, who is Economic Justice Program Officer, Action Aid Zambia. Good evening and a very warm welcome to the program.
Good evening viewers.
I also have Isabel Mkelabai, who is the Executive Director, CTPD. Good evening, Madam, and a very warm welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Good evening to you and to the viewers.
And finally, we have Chenai Mukumba, who is Center Coordinator, CATS Lusaka. Good evening and warm welcome to you too.
Good evening and thank you for having us.
Well, to get this ball rolling, perhaps the best place to start is to understand what role civil society organizations are doing in engaging government on the state of the economy. Perhaps you'd like to pick that one, Isabel.
I think civil society in Zambia is doing quite a number of things to basically call for economic accountability. Civil society has organized itself through different means, and the Civil Society Poverty Observatory Group is one such platform. As you earlier alluded to, this is a platform of over 30 local civil society organizations that seek to hold the Zambian government accountable for issues of poverty reduction as well as inequality. And in doing so, we do find relevance in interrogating the state of our economy so that economic growth can basically contribute to social impacts that we'd like to see. As you know, Zambia is one of those countries with very high income inequality levels. I think if you look at our Gini coefficient, we are at 0.65, meaning that Zambia is one of the most unequal countries in the world. We have over time interrogated why the Zambian economy has, on average, been quite impressive in terms of growth, but why that growth has basically not translated into social impacts and the reduction of poverty. If you look at some of the evaluations that have been done by government itself through the 5th National Development Plan, for example, you will find that in most provinces, poverty was actually on the increase. And it is from that angle that we basically make a relationship between economic performance and social impacts or improvements in the social conditions of the ordinary citizens of Zambia. And given that, I think we were very interested in looking at some of the occurrences in the economy for 2015. We did note that the Zambian economy faced a lot of distress, and that basically affected the projected growth of the economy in 2015, meaning that we did not meet targets as they were outlined, and because of that we took a specific interest to try and follow through what the impacts on poverty would basically be. So some of the interventions that we are doing now are pointing to the fact that we'd like to see greater prudence in economic management for 2016. Would like to see, I think, a different process being adopted by government and all relevant stakeholders in terms of trying to fix the Zambian economy. We recognize that no one sector perhaps can say that they are able to do that, but that at the country level, we need to have a consolidated, a comprehensive, and an inclusive process that is built on sharing ideas and recognizing that each sector brings expertise to the table, so that then we can basically look at the short-term and long-term plans in terms of addressing our economic challenges.
All right, so picking it from there, perhaps Kabinga, you'd like to share with us your reflections on Zambia's economic outlook and performance. What are some of the key observations made by civil society organizations?
I think there's been quite a number of observations that civil society we have made, and particularly if you look at our economy, first thing to note is that it's quite gloomy in terms of looking at the state of things. You might agree with me that if you look at in terms of first of all, like the cost of living, you agree with me that the cost of living has grown up. And actually, that has been necessitated by a number of factors. And for instance, the energy crisis that we are facing now, this has caused a lot of this has caused production to slow down, and particularly also we have seen the cost of essential commodities go up. Basically, these are like foodstuffs, milling meal, bread, to mention but a few. Then also going further, you note that there has been quite a number of job losses, largely driven by, of course, looking at the external economy. For instance, we know that mining is one of the major economic sector that we have, and it employs a lot of people. We have seen a lot of job losses in the mining sector. And to that effect, even other sectors that depend on the mines, they have also experienced job losses. Then also, as I mentioned, that if you look at the energy crisis, it's also putting more pressure in terms of companies faced with no choice but to lay off some workers in order to manage production. By that I mean looking at the current power crisis, you find that for a company it could be difficult, for instance, to keep a lot of workers, and where you just have maybe 2 hours of power in a day. So it becomes very difficult when you do your economics. It would be good, like for a company, just to maintain a few workers that are able to work. Then the rest are laid off. Then also going further, you note that even other cost of essential items other than food, they have also gone up. Talking about rent, we are talking about transport. So generally, as I mentioned, that the economy is gloomy. I think there isn't much to talk about, although we acknowledge that government has been trying to put up some measures, but I think the challenge has been that most of the measures are not sustainable. In the short term, they might look okay, but most of these measures, when you look at a long-term perspective, they are not sustainable. And by that, as a country, we are not addressing the real issues. For instance, let me give a practical example. We talk about mining as one of the key sectors, really, but as a country, you agree with me that we haven't done enough in terms of diversifying the economy. And most of the concentration has been on mining. And since years back, many stakeholders have been calling on government to invest in other sectors to create more jobs, but that hasn't happened. And also, if you look at even some of the short-term measures, for instance, we have seen that our government has tried to intervene. For instance, if you look at our foreign exchange, government has tried to intervene, but you agree with me that most of the interventions have not been long-term, they have been short-term. So generally, although government is doing something, but most of the measures are not sustainable. They are more of a short-term a view, but not so much of the long-term view. And that generally has posed a big challenge in terms of the economic scenario in our country.
You talk about the energy crisis, you talk about basic commodities prices going up. We are going to look at these issues in detail in a short while. But for now, what I would want you to address is your view on government's response to the challenges that the country is facing starting from 2015. How is government responding to these challenges? Are you satisfied?
No, not so much. I think first of all we need to understand that government, one, they have got the mandate to iron out things, and also two, government have got also the resources, both financial resources and both human resource. But if you look at some of their responses to the challenges we are facing, you note that they are not matching with maybe the capacity that government has in terms of both the financial. Of course, you might argue that, of course, things are a bit not good in terms of inflows of revenue from government is true, but we cannot deny the fact that still government has got some revenue. Then also, as I said, that the human resource, the capacity government has. But you might agree with me, for instance, if we look at some of the measures that government wants to put in place, like government has acknowledged that, okay, looking at the state of things now, there's need to caution in terms of expenditure. And government, through the president, sometime back last year in November, the president did have a press conference at State House where he highlighted a number of measures. Like one of the proposed measures was to cut unnecessary expenditure through unnecessary foreign travels, and also cutting expenditure through the misuse of public resources in the foreign service. Yeah, those were good measures, but I stand to be corrected, and you might agree with me that up to now we haven't heard so much in terms of what government has done towards those measures. So it just drives the point that quite okay, government is well aware of some of the challenges, but in terms of putting up the necessary measures to address some of these challenges, that has been lacking. Another example, for instance, would be, yes, it's true we have a power crisis, and at some point...
Yeah, maybe actually on that point, maybe let me bring in Chennai into the discussion, in terms of your perspective on how government has responded to the challenges in the power crisis. We're importing power. The Teji hydro power plant was launched a few days ago, and we know that government is doing certain things to try and curtail this power shortage. But are you satisfied with these responses? What more can they do?
It's a tricky question, and I think it's one of those where you find the government essentially putting in place measures to try and sort of alleviate the current situation that we're in. But at the same time, the government needs to be putting in place measures that have long-term prospects, more sustainable prospects. And so in terms of are they doing enough currently, it really depends on who you ask. I think a lot of the work that we do is try to increasingly engage civil society into this conversation. And I think a lot of what we're finding is that much of civil society feels that they themselves are not really feeling the impact of many of the measures that the government is taking at present. I think very often we see, news headlines and reports about measures that have been put in place, but I mean, sort of having conversations and some of the consultations we've been having, the question is, then why are we still experiencing, this load shedding to this extent? And so I think whilst we can see that the government is making, taking steps to sort of, do their best or to try to sort out the situation, there seems to be a little bit of a gap in terms of how it's being felt by the average person on the ground.
All right. Before we move away from government's response to, economic challenges being faced in Zambia, I would like Isabel to comment perhaps on this issue as well, in terms of your role as civil society, as you engage government, do you feel they are responding to you? Or perhaps it's just one of those academic exercises where you keep on bringing up ideas, and trying to engage them like we are doing today, but then there is no real response from the government. Is there an impact from civil society on government?
I think let me go back to what Musonda said earlier on, that first of all, government has a responsibility to make sure that the economy is managed well, and in doing so, government can be supported by different stakeholders where processes for supporting and where platforms exist. I think one of the major challenges at the moment is that there are no guaranteed spaces for that kind of engagement and participation. And further to that, I think civil society faces a lot of challenges in trying to engage government because these spaces are not guaranteed. So regardless of how good analysis can be, it's very difficult to basically keep the door open for engagement, even though we must be very quick to acknowledge that certain ministries have basically embraced civil society analysis in this country. So when we talk about ministries such as the Ministry of National Planning, for example, we have worked very well with the new ministry in terms of trying to look into issues of developing a poverty reduction framework, for example. The Ministry of Finance, we have been submitting proposals into the national budget policy instruments and so on and so forth. But for us, I think it's very difficult for us to really see the sort of measures that government is actually adopting from the sector per se. We know that government is receiving a lot of advice from different sectors. So industry is also advising, especially on issues of taxation. Civil society is also giving advice. Multilaterals are also giving advice. But for us, I think as a sector, what is important is try and identify where are the common interests when it comes to issues of economic management. We must understand that the issues that Musonda articulated earlier on and Chennai point to the fact that the Zambian economy is under stress. It is experiencing external shocks. It's also experiencing domestic shocks. On the external level, there are issues to do with the low commodity prices, and the slowing of economic growth in China, which is the largest consumer of copper in the world. And we know that most of our copper ends up in China. So when we look at, for example, the structure of our economy, which is very dependent on copper, we know that when China is affected in that manner, the same challenges we saw in 2015, we are still going to see in 2016. Our issue is that given everything that is at play, including the domestic shocks, which include a continued power deficit. We had it last year, it has continued into 2016. In fact, if you look at the power issues for 2016 now, we are experiencing more load shedding than we were experiencing in 2015 in certain areas. Now, this ultimately means that there is a direct impact on productivity. It means that our national output is being affected. And for as long as our national output is reducing, it means that we cannot generate the kind of revenue that we need to generate. So with reduced revenue, with reduced output, it means that our fiscus is being distressed. It means that we are going to have less money, less revenue, which ultimately means that the whole problem of having a fiscal deficit is going to continue even in 2016. So our question is, what do we need to do to address that? And we have been saying that civil society has tried to offer solutions around, first of all, cutting down on unnecessary expenditures, and Musonda talked about that. We have heard government really talking about implementing austerity measures, but the truth of the matter is that at the moment, our government is overspending. How do we know that? We are able to see from annual budget performance that the government is overspending. Every other year, government is basically overrunning its budget. That's a sign of very poor economic management. Because in a time when we are under distress in this manner, we should actually be reducing on unplanned for expenditure. We should be exercising a lot of caution in terms of where we are spending the money and making sure that we are actually prioritizing and using this money where we can actually make investments. At the micro level, we are looking at what is happening within the economy in terms of the businesses. Okay, it's become very difficult to do business in Zambia because the cost of doing business is extremely high. We've also been saying that the Bank of Zambia, of course, has been trying to contain inflation using monetary policy instruments. And we did see that there's been an attempt by the Bank of Zambia to sort of reduce to reduce spending in the economy by lifting or by increasing the cost of borrowing, so to say. And doing so basically means that it will basically also affect output because the businesses now can't borrow. Okay, it's expensive to borrow money, and because it's expensive to borrow money, it means the smaller businesses cannot increase their output. Ultimately, we find that job creation is also affected. Now, in an economy where unemployment is already high, it means that we will still have a lot of people unable to participate in economic activities because there will be no jobs. So ultimately, we are also saying civil society has been trying to give advice to the government in terms of how they can basically re-look at the job creation strategy, to look at, how low-level skills can be adopted and how we can create more jobs in sectors such as agriculture, where a lot more people can be involved in. We also see that over time there's been too much dependence around the economic debates in terms of looking at just mining and agriculture. We need to think strategically about other sectors such as transport, such as tourism, such as construction, because these are also important and robust drivers of economic growth for Zambia. So in terms of government really adopting, we do think that one of the barriers is the way that government basically looks at civil society. It's the way that in this country we have often viewed civil society as a sector that probably is a troublemaker and a sector that doesn't offer solutions.
What can you as civil society do to change that perception?
I think for us, we have tried to demonstrate that civil society is willing to engage in constructive dialogue. We have tried to demonstrate that civil society possesses relevant skill to do analysis on the state of the economy and even other pertinent issues that affect the nation. We have tried to put in place a lot of analytical papers that government can use and that government can basically use for national planning, that government can use to inform policy changes, that government can basically use to undertake reforms. And I think that many of the civil society organizations that do this kind of work have also strengthened their skills by actually doing them using recognized tools. And we do find that over time, government has taken an interest in certain pieces of work that we have done. For example, the basic needs basket that has been done by the Jesuit Center for Theological Reflection, the barometer that is also done by the Civil Society for Poverty Reduction, various analytical pieces that we do on trade as the Center for Trade Policy and Development, and even the budget instruments, the submissions for the budget instrument that we do on an annual basis through the Zambia.Tax platform, including some research pieces that have been done in the past, for example, around raising alarm for issues around tax avoidance, for example, that were done by ActionAid Zambia. So we've tried over time, I think, to demonstrate capacity in terms of really bringing to the table topical issues that are of policy relevance that government can basically use.
All right, so the cost of living in Zambia is increasing, and just today in the news we still had our president saying we cannot have meal fetching for as high as 120 kwacha. What is your view on Zambia's fiscal management policy, and what would you suggest going forward, Gavinga?
I think there are a number of things that we need to look at. Firstly, if we look at maybe looking at government expenditure, I think as Isabel alluded to and as I earlier alluded to, in terms of government expenditure, I think there are a lot of questions. And for instance, if you look at the latest Auditor General's report, you will note that I think there's so much mismanagement of public resources, and one wonders in terms of the drive by government to stop this, but on the other side, in the public service, what is happening where resources are being mismanaged, it just raises a lot of questions. Then also just to mention that sometimes also if you look at the pattern of expenditure by government, you note that in terms of, like, for instance, foreign travels, where we have said that we haven't seen any significant reduction by government. And apart from that, also I've alluded to the fact that if you look at foreign missions abroad, you note that there's so much mismanagement. Even coming down in our local economy, sometimes even if you look at some of the projects that are being done, people also have raised question in terms of maybe the quality of some of the works that are being done. It was just recently where we saw Chubi in Mpulungwe, where a bridge was washed away, and people said that it's a road actually, said it was just done a few months ago. So if you look at in terms of government expenditure, I think there is much that can be done. Then going further also, for instance, if you look at the issue of taxation, because the issues of taxation can also be used by government in terms of reducing some of the inequalities that Isabel talked about. But you agree with me that the taxation scenario in Zambia, there's a lot that people have talked about, and there has been really few changes. Let me begin by, for instance, we know that people have talked about the issue of tax avoidance, saying a lot of some big corporations have been involved in avoiding paying taxes. And at one point in time, it should be Honorable Mao Sampa. By then, I think he was Deputy Minister of Finance. He even argued that at one point in time that Zambia was losing a lot of money through some of issues around tax avoidance. And there was also a report done by one of a credible research institutions, that is the Global Financial Integrity, that also spoke about that. But that aside also, there has been studies that have been done locally, and ActionAid also did a study some time back that just shows that. But in terms of looking at government's response to addressing some of these issues, government has been a bit slow. For instance, at one point you might agree with me that there was the KCM issue where should be one of the owners of KCM came and I think he bragged a lot about the revenues that he was making, which we didn't see in Zambia, and we have never seen.
An infamous story indeed.
Yeah, and there was an audit that was done, but up to now, we haven't been told in terms of the audit findings. So these are some of the areas where we have seen that the response by government is quite slow. Just recently, like last year, the president alluded to the fact that government plans to establish a task force composed of various government agencies to look at issues of revenue, which was good, but we haven't heard anything up to now. So if you talk of issues of fiscal policy, if you look at government expenditure, you look at the issues of taxation, I think there's a lot that we can do as a country. And these actually also relate to the issues I talk about addressing poverty, because if government expenditure is not prudent, as it has been seen in the Auditor General's report, then you cannot address poverty. Majority of Zambians, they depend on public services. And if public services are not available because resources are being mismanaged, then a lot of Zambians won't be able to access that, and the talk about poverty will still continue. Then also, if you talk of taxation, if we fail to address some of the concerns raised as regards to taxing corporations that have been cited to be involved in some tax avoidance, if government cannot address some of those challenges in a timely manner, because the issue of time is also important. You find that revenues won't be there for government to spend on social services. So I think those are some of the concerns.
Okay, let's now zero in into the energy sector and consider some of the developments which have been happening. I did mention earlier on the launch of the Teji hydropower station. A few weeks ago, we also learned that the water levels at Kariba have improved by 1.6 meters. But we don't seem to be getting, the results of these positive developments in our homes. Even Isabel was saying that load shedding has actually increased. Do you think the energy crisis has been competently managed?
I think when discussing the energy crisis, it's important to also take a look at when it started. And this really requires us to take a perspective, understanding that, in the early 2000s, that's when many experts already began to foresee that we were going to eventually have an energy crisis. And part of this was essentially because Zambia, for the past 15 years, has been having economic growth above 5%. But our level of energy capacity and generation hasn't been able to meet up with that. And so even then there was a need to begin to increase our electricity generation. But that didn't happen at that time. And so now we find ourselves in a situation where the energy capacity can't meet the demand. And so I think most people, just when talking about electricity in general, and I think correctly so, we have been experiencing less than average rainfalls, which have contributed to the energy crisis. But that itself isn't the only reason for why we are where we are today. There's various studies that sort of analyze the situation, but some experts actually say that even if Zambia was to experience above average rainfalls, that alone would only take us out of the energy crisis in 2018. And so it's not only the water situation that has us where we are today, it's also part of a lack of foresight that has us today, which really involves not having been able to invest in infrastructure that would have essentially avoided us being where we are today. So there's a number of different factors that have us where we are today and have contributed to the crisis.
So we can go round and round in circles discussing the problem. I think what people are more interested in now is the solution. We're already in this situation.
Yeah.
So what short-term measures are you proposing to government, and what are the long-term measures that you'd like government to put in place?
I think when talking short-term measures, the government has essentially, started implementing some. The only problem, like I mentioned earlier, is that we are importing energy, and our deficit is essentially, it's supposed to be decreasing. But a lot of civil society, a lot of the average person says, if this is the case, why are the hours that we have for load shedding not decreasing? Why are we not seeing this? And I think it is important for the government to put in place measures that can tackle the current shortage, although this can't be it. And the reason it's important to have measures to address the short-term challenges is because, as Isabel mentioned, not being able to provide energy at present affects productivity, it affects production, and also depending on where you are within the economy, sometimes it has direct negative implications on your livelihood, especially in some rural areas, in small businesses as well. But in addition to this, there needs to be a long-term view, a long-term sustainable view, and there needs to be policy coherence in the decision-making that the government is making towards this direction. So, like I mentioned earlier, it's important essentially to balance these two. It's important to put in place measures that can sort of alleviate the current burden we're dealing with now, but at the same time start to think long-term, start to think proactively, start to think about the investment in infrastructure that needs to happen now, start to think, should we be, which renewable, perhaps alternative energy sources are we looking at? It requires, I think, strategic thought, and I think this is sort of where we're also trying to contribute to with regards to providing solutions and also bringing in the perspectives of many other stakeholders within this energy debate that, that tend to be marginalized.
In case you're just joining us, you're watching a special program. We're discussing the state of the economy. You can contribute to the program. Your keyword is ASK and the line is 3322. Now, on the fiscal and monetary front, we note that government has continued to borrow money in the name of building infrastructure that will facilitate economic development. Do you think this is a sustainable way to go in terms of facilitating economic development and growth? We've had certain sectors of society saying, we will not eat the roads, what we want is a reduction in the cost of living.
That issue of saying we will not eat the roads has become a very common saying, and I think it's because sometimes it's very difficult for people to make the connection between what we require in terms of infrastructure to grow our economy, open up the transport corridors, and also linking it to where the priorities should be. I think it's the issue of failing to link what we require in terms of the economic infrastructure to sustain our growth and what people expect in terms of the social focus of what government should be doing. I think for us as civil society, we do think that it's very important that government begins to invest in building economic infrastructure, because Zambia is one of the countries that is emerging economically, and the opportunities for us, the prospects economically, I think are quite vast. But I think there are a number of things that we need to do at the country level in terms of building the economic infrastructure, and that is why beyond the discussion of roads, it's also what Chennai was talking about. It's about making sure that we have a proper plan for providing energy, even for investors that come in, because I think when investors are coming in, they are looking to see how well we have economic infrastructure that can support those investments. But when we look at all these ambitious targets and projects, I think for us, what we question really is the scale of intervention. We have quite a number of ambitious projects that have been done, and over time I think we notice that, especially in election years, we tend to see a lot of unplanned economic projects being done. You do recall that at some point the MMD government went into Formula One roads. Whilst that was a good thing, I think it was at a huge cost to Treasury. And this is why we are saying that there is need for a very clear plan when it comes to the issues of infrastructure development. We need to be doing the infrastructure development in such a way that it is well planned, well thought through.
So
and
you do not support
financing.
the borrowing in order to finance the infrastructure development?
Not necessarily that we don't support borrowing. You know, borrowing is a normal part of managing an economy. So borrowing in itself is not an evil. But I think for us, what we don't agree with is that government has issued a number of Eurobonds, and we are unable to basically track where these funds are being invested and what the economic benefits of those investments are. What we are against also is the fact that government should not borrow for consumption. We would like to see government borrowing and putting that money in drivers of growth. Okay, so basically, I think the challenge that we have at the moment is that we've taken out a lot of debt. In fact, as of last year, our external debt was standing, I think last year, August, our external debt was standing somewhere around $6.8 million. That's quite significant. In terms of percentage to GDP, it was somewhere around 32.7. Now, with all these things that have happened in between, where the debt ceiling now, the threshold, in fact, has been approved to be increased by Parliament, it means that the debt stock may basically rise. And for us, I think we are questioning the fact that we seem to be thinking that debt is the only way to finance a lot of economic projects. It may not be. We need to look at in-house measures as well. Government already has a target of raising resources domestically. I think the target is about 20.4% of GDP. That is the target for 2016. Last year it was around 18.1%. But with all these challenges, we seem to be running more to getting debt rather than looking at ways of minimizing certain expenditures internally, so that we are able to use that money where we really need to be using it. The second thing I think is around what Musonda said. If you are an economy that is losing about $3 billion in issues of corporate tax dodging, why won't you want to address that as an immediate quick win, because it would free up some resources that is more or less equal to what you are borrowing? Why would you want to borrow? Because borrowing is at a cost. So for us, we are looking at really how much of the cost-benefit analysis is being done by government when these decisions are being taken. And we are saying, if there are other options, why isn't government being prudent to pursue those options rather than run to the sovereign bond markets to issue the sovereign bonds? So we are saying it's important that we really have a clear mechanism for monitoring and evaluating debt that we are contracting as a country. It's important that there is transparency also in terms of where the money is being used. It's also important that we desist from borrowing for consumption. We do not want to see a situation where funds are borrowed and they are channeled into the electoral process. We do not want to see a situation where funds that are being borrowed are not being invested, such as the energy sector. Now we have a crisis. We have a power crisis, and we know that if this power crisis is not addressed adequately and strategically, we are going to go into 2017 with the same scenario. And we must understand that with an economy like Zambia, we need to sustain a certain growth level in order to reduce poverty. So if the economy begins to contract, we're going to have serious issues around raising money for social spending. Already it is a challenge to provide social services to the people. You can see that in the hospitals, even if you visit UTH, we have by design a mechanism where there's a fast track, which is under the high cost. And then there is the ordinary track for you and me, which we go to, and sometimes there is no medicine. What we are saying is that over time, we must, as a country, have a focus on raising resources that would allow us to provide the minimum standard of health services for all, because access to health must be given to all in a timely manner. So there are a number of elements that we need to look at, but for us, I think our position is very clear, that we appreciate that debt is a normal part of economic management, but the manner within which it is being done is what we question, and it is that manner that we disagree with.
All right. An aspect that we obviously cannot leave untouched on a forum such as this is job losses, which have rocked the country. Over 4,300 miners sent into forced retrenchment by the mining giant Mopani Copper Mines. Kabinga, what in your perspective do you think is the cause of this?
Mining is a very interesting issue, and discussing mining really raises a lot of questions. I think first of all, it's clear that mining is one of the most important sectors in terms of driving growth and also revenue earning. But when discussing mining, I think we need to understand that some time back, when mining was in the hands of the Zambian government, by that I mean when mining was being driven by the Zambia Consolidated Copper Mine, ZCCM, a lot of things were known about, for instance, issues of production costs, issues of how much in terms of minerals that are being mined, in terms of the quantity. But I think the challenge now that we have, and that's why we experience some of the challenges in the mining sector, is that I think as a country we still, as at now, don't have a lot of sufficient information about what is really happening in terms of our mining sector. By that I mean, one, in terms of production, two, in terms of production costs. If you go, for instance, to different government agencies, you go to Bank of Zambia, you go to Ministry of Mines, you go to Ministry of Finance, you'll be shocked that sometimes maybe you can get different data in terms of production figures. And by that, if you're talking about addressing mining, we need to reach a level whereby we understand everything relating to mining. So I think the biggest challenge has been that as a country, I think we are slow in terms of knowing exactly what it involves in terms of the entire chain around mining. By that, as I said, production costs, in terms of the quantity of the minerals being mined, And as a result of that, that's where we have issues whereby sometimes even if minerals are exported, in terms of the revenue that we are earning, sometimes is not what people expect, for instance. So now coming to the issue of job losses, yes, it's true that the external economy, there has been some shocks, as Isabel mentioned, and that has affected the mining sector in terms of the low commodity prices. But that aside, I think as a country also we haven't done so much in terms of issues of ensuring that we diversify our economy so that we are able to ensure that there are also other job opportunities around other sectors. So the issue whereby we have concentrated so much on mining, and as a result of that, we have seen job losses. Then also to mention in terms of the tax regime, you might agree that Zambia's mining tax regime has been quite unstable. There has been frequent changes regarding taxation of the mines. And I think as a country, we need to reach a situation where we have quite a stable mining tax framework. And that will ensure that there is stability in the mining sector. That will ensure that even the job losses we are talking about are minimized. For instance, we know that at one point, the Minister of Finance did increase the royalties, and we saw what the mining companies did. They were involved in some lobbying, and part of that lobbying, they raised a number of issues. Some threatened that they will close some mining companies, and as a result, some also threatened that they will lay off workers, and there are reports that some even managed to lay off workers. So if you look at that, that just points to the fact that without a stable mining tax regime, we'll continue experiencing what we are experiencing in the mining sector. And the solution to that is that as a country, we need to move towards a stable mining tax regime, and that will come when we understand everything that is involved around mining. You might argue that, yes, government is there and they know, to some extent, but as I said, that if you go to different government agencies, you'll see that the figure you get for production, maybe from Bank of Zambia, could be different from ZRA, could be different from the Central Statistics Office. And by that, what are we saying? We are saying that we are not so sure in terms of how much is going out. So addressing mining, really, we need to address all those issues that I've mentioned and come up with a stable mining regime. And that will also involve calling all stakeholders sitting on one table and discussing and coming up with a sustainable mining tax regime.
All right. Very quickly, I think let's also look at the agricultural sector, which contributes about 10% to Zambia's gross domestic product. It remains one of the key sectors for Zambia's economic growth, and it employs approximately 67% of Zambia's workforce, and the sector is a main source of raw materials for industry. What are the views of you as civil society on the management of the agricultural sector? Some political players have been accusing government of mismanaging this particular sector. What are your views?
Well, we think that there have been a lot of reforms in the agriculture sector. If you follow through, there has been a lot of discussion at the policy level and a lot of reforms that have happened in the agriculture sector. The question is the agriculture sector currently transforming the lives of ordinary small-scale farmers, for example? Is the agriculture sector contributing as much as it should be? Have we galvanized the potential of the agricultural sector? We would say that we haven't yet done that. We have recognized that the agriculture sector is pivotal for economic development in Zambia. We have recognized that the agriculture sector has a lot of potential, but we think that that potential still remains untapped. And why do we say that? We are looking at the fact that currently the agriculture sector faces a number of challenges from the supply side. We, at the moment, I think we have a lot of challenges around the low yields in the agricultural sector. If you're looking at crops, we have a challenge because of the current methods that we are using for agricultural production, crop production, that is. If you're looking at livestock, we have challenges still around livestock diseases and so on and so forth. If you're also looking at things around trade in the agricultural sector, we are saying the potential is there, because when we look now at the non-traditional exports, we are seeing that increasingly tobacco is taking a lead. We are seeing that increasingly maize is also beginning to take a lead in helping us to grow our non-traditional exports. But we still have a challenge in terms of production. And this is why at the beginning of the program we did say that there is need to really look at other sectors of the economy away from just looking at mining and agriculture, to really look at comprehensively how other sectors of the economy can begin to give us the kind of national output that we are looking for. But again, coming back to the agricultural sector, we think that there is need to really address the production constraints. What is it really that is causing us to not be at the level of production that we should be at the country? Our observation and our perspective is that Zambia has the potential to become a regional food basket, but we have a lot of challenges on the production side of things. If you look at the support that is going to small-scale farmers, we at the moment are only able to take on about 1 million farmers under the Farmer Input Support Program. And whilst on one hand we do support the subsidies towards the production of agricultural products, we are quite happy with the introduction of the e-voucher, because the e-voucher introduces a mechanism for diversifying the agriculture sector. The e-voucher also introduces a very efficient way for government to run a program such as that one, because there is a pass-on effect in terms of cost to the private sector. What we think that is that over time, government should really scale up the implementation of programs such as the e-voucher, because I think that the levels of efficiency and effectiveness there are higher than when we invest in traditional programs such as the Farmer Input Support Program. And we can see already that even now when government has piloted these in 13 districts, yes, there have been a lot of teething problems, but I think we can see already that there is potential that such a program can basically help to improve the implementation challenges that we have seen for a very long time under the Farmer Input Support Program.
All right.
Yes.
I'll have to stop you there, because there's one other issue which we have to tackle very quickly, and this is in your recommendations on the extractive sector. You talk of a mineral revenue sharing mechanism which will allow ring fencing of funds to guarantee development projects at community level. We would like to understand what exactly is this mineral revenue sharing mechanism, and are there any countries in Africa which employ it?
Yeah, basically, you might know, you might agree with us that there is already some mechanisms that government has put in place in terms of ensuring that people are able to share revenues. There are a number of systems that are being implemented by government and a number of funds to that effect. But when we talk about a mineral revenue sharing mechanism, here we are talking about having some sort of a consolidated kind of mechanism that will clearly stipulate in terms of the benefits from mining, for instance, the benefits in terms of what a particular community should be able to get, and also the benefits in terms of what the central government should be able to get. So here we are talking more of a consolidated mechanism. Of course, we are alive to the fact that there are other funds in place that government has put across. For instance, we have issues of the social cash transfer and all other things. But specifically with a mineral revenue sharing mechanism, what we are talking about is a consolidated mechanism that needs to be put in place that will clearly stipulate in terms of the revenues that will go, for instance, to a particular community that might be housed within a mining community, the revenues that will go, for instance, to the district level, the revenue that will go to the central government. And there are a number of countries that have put in place such systems in place. For instance, Ghana is one of the countries. And as at now, as civil society organizations, we have a group that we are working with in terms of trying to come up with a model of a mineral revenue sharing mechanism that we want to put in place. And of course, that group is composed of various organizations, and you may wish to know that also some government agencies are part of that group. So we are trying to come up with a model, and at the appropriate time, I think we'll share in terms of our findings in terms of the model that we want governments to put in place.
All right. As we conclude the program, I would like us to respond to some of the messages that we've received from our viewers. The first one is regarding the Zambezi. One of our viewers feels the Zambezi is full, and it is the source of water at the Kariba Dam. So he is expecting, or she's expecting, full generation. That is Chipango in Mufumbwe. I'll direct that question to you, Chinai.
I wish it was that simple, but it really isn't. Like I think, like I tried to sort of explain earlier, the crisis that we're facing is much more complex than that. It has to deal with the fact that we're unable to generate the amount of energy we need to meet the level of economic growth we're at. And so a lot more investment into infrastructure and to ensure that we can generate more needs to be put in place.
All right. The other question is coming from Mwisho in Solwezi. He's saying his interactions with people in the community reveal that there is poverty, there is no food, and there are no schools. How would you respond to his message, Kaving?
I mean, it's true. It just echoes what we have been talking about. It's very true that if you go outside the Rhino Rail in Zambia, what you see, and a civil society organization having the opportunity to interact with many Zambians outside the rail line, what we have observed is quite bad in terms of what people are going through, where you see that sometimes people, for instance, walk up to 27 kilometers to the nearest hospital. We have seen people who drink, for lack of a better term, I would say bad water that when you see at first, you don't know whether it's water or what is there. So it's very true, their poverty levels are quite high in rural areas. And as civil society organization, we have been calling on government, and we have been making several submissions that Isabe alluded to, trying to urge government to ensure that I think we speed up the issue of rural development. And some of the submissions, for instance, that we have made has been that government can increase funding towards sectors that are like agriculture, where a lot of rural people really depend on agriculture for their needs. But if you look at the allocations towards agriculture, it's still below the international standards that have been stipulated. And also, if you look at, for instance, quite okay, maybe someone would say, what about the FISIP? It's true there's FISIP, but if you look at the actual benefit in terms of FISIP, and there are stories about the management of FISIP. So I think I would pause for that.
All right. The final question was directed at CTPD, asking you if you have advised the president on the challenges that the country is facing. And I would like to add my earlier question to say, you know, if this advice that we're giving to government is not receiving any response, then what is the point of it?
I think that the president is supported by a number of economic institutions in this country that have been established to provide support for economic management and governance. And we have provided analytical papers and analytical thinking and policy advice to the respective organizations. For example, when the ZDA Act was being reviewed, CTPD made a submission directly to the Zambia Development Agency to advise and indicate which specific clauses and articles needed to be revised in order to provide a more conducive environment for investment in this country. We have also, through the Ministry of Finance, been able to give submissions for the budget instrument, and I alluded to that earlier on as examples of what we've been doing. We also sit on a number of technical working groups that have been put together by different government agencies. For example, we are members of the Zambia EITI Council, and we sit on the EITI multi-stakeholder group. So we do provide our advice on various platforms through these relevant economic institutions. But the issue really of government adopting what it is we are advising at the end of the day is a choice that government makes. What we do see, though, is that there is never any feedback in terms of the issues that are adopted or those that are not adopted and why they are not adopted. So to answer that question simply, we would say yes, we have done that with the relevant economic institutions of this country.
Thank you so much. You have been watching a special program where we've been discussing the state of the economy, particularly economic management and fiscal policy. My guests have been Isabel Mkilabai, who is the Executive Director, CTPD. I also had Janai Mukumba, who is Center Coordinator, CATS Lusaka, as well as Kavinga Musonda, Economic Justice Program Officer, Action Aid Zambia. I've been your host, Ngenda Kamayoyo. Thanks a lot for watching. Keep it right here on your channel of choice.
TV subscription right at your doorstep. Look out for your Movie TV pay point in your area.